Greetings in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ on this day in which we consider Proper 20 from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 37 on the 20th of September in 2015. We have been reading through Mark 9 now for 2 weeks. This is the second week, and there'll be a third week next week. The continuous reading of Mark gives you an indication of how it was that the early Christians would have read the gospel. So we're seeing the teaching of Jesus unfold in its sort of logical way. Today, what we do consider is the second passion prediction in Mark. The first one, of course, occurs at the very beginning of this section where Jesus predicts his death at the end of Mark 8. And the transfiguration that begins chapter 9. So these are all very much compressed with one another. The third one, of course, comes in chapter 10. One of the things that is important to note about this text is that it's got two parts to it, and we'll see that very simply. It's really a very simple text on many levels, preaches itself. What we're going to see here is that there are two parts to this text, and they're very important if you look at the relationship between the two. The first one has to do with this passion prediction, and we'll note a few things about it that distinguish it from the first one. And then this discussion that comes up here in Mark's gospel. As you know, I'm sort of a Luke guy, so I'm always interested in where this occurs in Luke. In Luke, the question of who is the greatest comes at the Lord's Supper. But in 33 to 37, we really have one of those statements about reversal and a statement about children, which will be developed later in Mark. And then, of course, you've got this wonderful statement here about hospitality, welcoming, with the language of welcoming. And I think one of the challenges, and it's not actually that difficult, is to connect the two, to connect the passion prediction with this second part. And I really think in many ways, if you're thinking about preaching on this in a kind of a logical way in which the text lays it out, you would want to have part one on the passion prediction and part two on the sayings that flow out of it. So that gives us a little sense here of the two parts. And we'll start now with part one. Part one here, if we look at it carefully, has a number of things that I think are worthy of our attention. First of all, we see that Jesus is still in Galilee. He's passing through Galilee. This is that journey language. And the beginning of the next pericope you'll see is he's in Capernaum, and that's where he had his home base. He's, I think, even in his house, which was probably the house of Peter's mother-in-law, where Peter lived. That's probably where this is spoken. And we're going to see that there are, in a sense, two different groups here. One is the disciples, okay, and in the next one it's going to be just the 12. Now, they could be exactly the same, but the disciples can sometimes be a little larger group. So this is a little bit more general, and then it's going to be specific about the discussion of who is the greatest. And you can see that it's the surrounding Jesus with his own kind of inner core of disciples, the 12, who, of course, become the apostles. The text starts out very, very simply with Jesus journeying, and it's really interesting here how he didn't want anyone to know, where they were going, where they were. I think one of the reasons is, and it's part of this kind of messianic secret that we talk about, and that is that when he talks here about the passion, he is keeping this in the inner core because it's such a scandal. And we'll see that their response is that, ooh, that's really dark. They did not They did not know this word, which I think is a really interesting, statement. And it says here they were afraid to ask him. Now you'll see this language in Luke too, but what they're not understanding is the language of the passion. And so you do get a strong sense here of the messianic secret. Now, as I said, this is the second passion prediction. So they've heard this before, and there seems to be an increasing kind of sense that they are not able to fully grasp what it is that Jesus is saying. Now, this is described, and I think this is important language, it's described as teaching. So this is, in many ways, the heart of the kerygma. And those of you who have heard me before, this is the heart of all preaching, what we see here. And it's a little bit formulaic. The Son of Man, of course, is the language that Jesus uses of himself, especially in suffering. This is where Jesus is in his humility, in his passion. Here is the language of passion, betrayal, paradidomi. Some of you know this has the two different senses in the scriptures. One is the language of betrayal, which is shorthand for his whole passion, including not just his suffering, but his death. It also is the word for tradition, the handing down of something, and that these are certainly related. The heart of the tradition is the passion, the betrayal. That's the preaching. That is, of course, the kerygma. And so this is a word that is very commonly used. We know it well. It's one that it has become, like I said, shorthand for the passion itself. Very general into the hands of men. That's a bit ambiguous, but we know certainly it includes the Jewish leaders. It will include even somebody like Herod. It would include the soldiers, so he's going to be betrayed into the hands of the religious leaders. And then Mark chooses here to use a particular word here that I think is quite interesting for this particular passion prediction. He uses the language of killing. Okay, they will kill him, and after killing him, he will be raised. Notice there's the 3 days. Raised after 3 days, and this comes at the end here. This is a common word that we'll find in the passion predictions. So what you have here is you've got betrayal, which suggests the suffering. Then you have the killing, the death, and then the resurrection. It's quite simple. And again, I think that there is room, even here in the middle of the Pentecost season, to dwell on the heart of what it is that Jesus is teaching. I am always been quite taken by this word here, rhema. I'm not sure that everybody will agree with me on this, but Luke does the same thing. That is the word for word when it is related to the passion. And it's interesting that Mary uses this word in the Annunciation, let it be to me according to your word, your chrema, and I think the passion is implied there. But it's not logos, it's chrema, and there's that sense of the Spirit's breathing, and they did not understand this saying about his passion. And they were afraid to ask him. Notice fear to ask him about the kerygma, the heart of the faith. That's really quite extraordinary. And you have to ask yourself what actually is happening to them. How are they computing this? You've probably heard people talk about the messianic secret, but one of the reasons why I think Jesus, in a sense, hides this from them by seeing it in such a way that they are not able to comprehend it is because it's too much. They cannot possibly take in all that this means, and it's not until the resurrection that they are going to fully be able to grasp the significance of it. as you can see, there's lots to say here. But let us go to the second part of this and see how it relates to the first. And let me see if I can do this. Nope. How do I get rid of this here? John, maybe, do I do it here? Oh, yeah. Okay. I know, I got it. Yeah, I put it there. Sorry.
You have to go to the mouse here.
I got to go to the mouse. Okay. Oh, the mouse. Yeah. Got it. I knew that. Here we go. I'm not getting it. John, scroll for me. Okay, here we go. He's got it. There we go. Good. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating about this particular section is the language that begins it, and that is the language of on the way. Now, I don't want to make too much of this. It certainly is a big Lucan thing, but the way, is obviously the way to Jerusalem. But this is catechetical language. This is pilgrim language, and Jesus is teaching them what it means to be a pilgrim, what it means to be journeying to the destiny of death and suffering. And as I said before, they're in Capernaum. And he asked them in the house what they were dialoguing. What was the dialogue? So obviously the apostles are having this sort of inner fight. And if you go to Luke, after the supper, they're dialoguing about who is the greatest. I put this in green here because that is really, you got to think of this in contrast to the kerygma of passion. They're asking who is the greatest. And Jesus has just talked about the complete emptying of himself in suffering. So there's sort of such an incredible disconnect there. And if you notice here, they almost kind of stand condemned because they were silent when he asked them, "What are you talking about?" And they don't want to say. They don't want to say that this is what they're talking about, about being the greatest. That is really, in many ways, very self-condemning. And really the language there is they're arguing. They're arguing as to who of them is the greatest. And you know how this spills out in the sons of Zebedee and that kind of thing. But anyway, Jesus, the rabbi, sits down, okay? And here it is, the language of the 12. Let me put another color here. The language of the 12. So this is that inner circle. This is apostolic teaching. This is teaching that is at the heart of those who are walking the way with Jesus to Jerusalem. And it's one of those reversal texts. And this is a way of talking about the theology of the cross. If you want to be first, you've got to be last. And there's the language of service. You want to be a servant of all, diakonos. And this is exactly the opposite of what they were probably asking in terms of greatest. The greatest is the last. The greatest is the servant. So in a way, let's see, where would it be? It would be, well, it's really just this verse here, but it's set up here. Here is the teaching of Jesus. Here is his, in a sense, his telling them, what it is that they should understand about themselves in light of their conversation about who is the greatest. And if that's the teaching, then here is sort of the proof. Here is the object lesson. And the object lesson is going to be indicated here by the language of a child. Paidion. And that, of course, is what it means to be a servant, what it means to be the last. It's to be like a child. And I love the scene here, the way Mark puts it. He takes the child and he stands the child in the midst of them, places him in the midst of them. And then, and I think that's literally taking him into his arms, the child. So here's that touching of Mark's gospel, how Jesus is very tactile. You know, he takes this child into his arms, and then he uses the child here to do this profound teaching. And here's that language, as I mentioned before, of hospitality. I put it here in the yellow. Look at that, the language of welcoming, of receiving, 4 times here, you know? And that is at the heart of the kingdom, welcoming people like we would welcome children. And you know, this is the language of Jesus' mercy. That is the heart of the theology of the cross, that he shows mercy by welcoming people who come to him in that innocent sense of being a servant, recognizing that they are the last. And I don't want to make too much of this, but that's profound language later on in the church in my name. It certainly is language that Jesus uses too, and it's certainly baptismal language. What we welcome them in through this sort of water and the word, and there's such profound sense of even the Trinity here, where you say, he does not welcome me, but the one who sent me, the Father. So there's an awful lot of implications here in the language of how one receives a child is the way in which one receives Jesus and the way in which one receives the Father. And so those who are the least in the kingdom, those who are the broken, the poor, the merciful, the servants, the ones who are not arguing whether they are the greater, they are the ones who we are to welcome. And that is, in a sense, the essence of the Christian pilgrimage. That as we go, we take to ourselves those who are broken, those who are in need of our, of our diakonia, because they are people who are broken by the things of this world. So there's a tremendous amount of connection then between the 2 parts of these texts. And one of the things that I would recommend as we bring this to a close over the preaching of Proper 20 is that it gives us a chance to focus again on the heart of the kerygma, the passion and resurrection of Jesus, and the implications of that in how it is that we show hospitality to those who really are related to the kerygma because they are embodying the brokenness of what it means to be least in the kingdom of God.